Part 3, Chapter 22 of The Job. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Job by Sinclair Lewis. Part 3, Man and Woman. Chapter 22. Of the year and a half, from March 1914 to the autumn of 1915, which Una spent on Long Island as the resident salesman and director of Crosshampton Hill Gardens, this history has little to say, for it is a treatise regarding a commonplace woman on a job. And at the Gardens there was no job at all, but one long summer day of flushed laughter. It is true that values were down on the North Shore at this period, and sales slow. It is true that Una, in high tan boots and a tweed suit from a sporting goods house, supervised carpenters in constructing a bungalow as local office and dwelling place for herself. It is true that she quarreled with the engineer planning the walks and sewers, usurped authority and discharged him, and had to argue with Mr. Truax for 3 hours before he sustained her decision. Also, she spent an average of 9 hours a day in waiting for people, or in showing them about, and serving tea and biscuits to dusty female villa hunters. And she herself sometimes ran a lawn-mower and cooked her own meals. But she had respect, achievement, and she ranged the open hills from the stirring time when dogwood blossoms filled the ravines with a fragrant mist, round the calendar and on till the elms were gorgeous with a second autumn, and sunsets marched in naked glory of archangels over the Connecticut hills beyond the flaming waters of Long Island Sound. Slow-moving, but gentle, were the winter months, for she became a part of the commuting town of Crosshampton Harbor, not as the negligible daughter of a Panama Captain Golden, but as a woman with the glamour of independence, executive position, city knowledge, and a certain marital mystery. She was invited to parties at which she obediently played bridge, to dances at the Harbor Yacht Club, to meetings of the Village Friendly Society. A gay, easy-going group, with cocktail mixers on their sideboards, and motors in their galvanized iron garages, but also with savings bank books in the drawers beneath their unit bookcases, took her up as a woman who had learned to listen and smile. And she went with them to friendly, unexacting dances at the Year-Round Inn, conducted by Charlie Duquesne, in the impoverished Duquesne mansion on Smiley Point. She liked Charlie, and gave him advice about bedroom chintzes for the inn, and learned how a hotel is provisioned and served. Charlie did not know that her knowledge of chintzes was about 2 weeks old, and derived from a buyer at Wanamacy's. He only knew that it solved his difficulties. She went into the city about once in 2 weeks, just often enough to keep in touch with Truax, Fine, Chaz, and Mamie Magen, the last of whom had fallen in love with a socialistic Gentile Charities secretary, fallen out again, and was quietly dedicating all her life to Hebrew charities. Una closed the last sale at Crosshampton Hill Gardens in the autumn of 1915, and returned to town, to the office world and the job. Her record had been so clean and promising that she was able to demand a newly created position, woman sales manager, at $2,500 a year, selling direct and controlling 5 other women salesmen. Mr. Truax still "didn't believe in" women salesmen, and his lack of faith was more evident now that Una was back in the office. Una grew more pessimistic as she realized that his idea of women salesmen was a pure, high, aloof thing which wasn't to be affected by anything happening in his office right under his nose. But she was too busy selling lots, instructing her women aides, and furnishing a 4-room flat near Stuyvesant Park to worry much about Mr. Truax. And she was sure that Mr. Fein would uphold her. She had the best of reasons for that assurance, namely that Mr. Fein had hesitatingly made a formal proposal for her hand in marriage. She had refused him for 2 reasons: that she already had one husband somewhere or other, and the more cogent reason that though she admired Mr. Fein, found him as cooling and pleasant as lemonade on a July evening, she did not love him, did not want to mother him, as she had always wanted to mother Walter Babson, and as, now and then, when he had turned to her, she had wanted to mother even Mr. Schwirtz. The incident brought Mr. Schwirtz to her mind for a day or two, but he was as clean gone from her life as was Mr. Henry Carson of Panama. She did not know, and did not often speculate, whether he lived or continued to die. If the world is very small, after all, it is also very large, and life and the world swallow up those whom we have known best, and they never come back to us. Una had, like a freshman envying the seniors, like a lieutenant in awe of the council of generals, always fancied that when she became a real executive, with a salary of several thousands, and people coming to her for orders, she would somehow be a different person from the good little secretary. She was astonished to find that in her private office and her new flat, and in her new velvet suit, she was precisely the same yearning, meek, efficient woman as before. But she was happier. Despite her memories of Schwirtz, and the fear that sometime, someplace, she would encounter him and be claimed as his wife, and despite a less frequent fear that America would be involved in the great European war, Una had solid joy in her office achievements, in her flat, in taking part in the vast suffrage parade of the autumn of 1915, and feeling comradeship with thousands of women. Despite Mr. Fein's picture of the woes of executives, Una found that her new power and responsibility were inspiring, as her little stenographer's wage had never been. Nor, though she did have trouble with the women responsible to her at times, though she found it difficult to secure employees on whom she could depend, did Una become a female Troy Wilkins. She was able to work out some of the aspirations she had cloudily conceived when she had herself been a slave. She did find it possible to be friendly with her aides, to be on tea and luncheon and gossip terms of intimacy with them, to confide in them instead of tricking them, to use frank explanations instead of arbitrary rules, and she was rewarded by their love and loyalty. Her chief quarrels were with Mr. Truax in regard to raising the salaries and commissions of her assistant saleswomen. Behind all these discoveries regarding the state of being an executive, behind her day's work and the evenings at her flat when Mamie Magen and Mr. Fein came to dinner, there were 2 tremendous secrets. For her personal life, her life outside the office, she had found a way out such as might, perhaps, solve the question of loneliness for the thousands of other empty-hearted, fruitlessly aging office women. Not love of a man. She would rather die than have Schwirtz's clumsy feet trampling her reserve again. And the pleasant men who came to her flat were just pleasant. No, she told herself, She did not need a man or man's love, but a child's love and presence she did need. She was going to adopt a child. That was her way out. She was 34 now, but by 6 of an afternoon she felt 40. Youth she would find, youth of a child's laughter and the healing of its downy sleep. She took counsel with Mamie Magen, who immediately decided to adopt a child also, and praised Una as a discoverer, and with the good housekeeping women she knew at Crosshampton Harbor. She was going to be very careful. She would inspect a dozen different orphan asylums. Meanwhile, her second secret was making life pregnant with interest. She was going to change her job again, for the last time, she hoped. She was going to be a creator, a real manager, unhampered by Mr. Truax's unwillingness to accept women as independent workers, and by the growing animosity of Mrs. Truax. Una's interest in the year-round inn at Crosshampton Harbor, the results obtained by reasonably good meals and a little chintz, and her memory of the family hotel, had led her attention to the commercial possibilities of innkeeping. She was convinced that, despite the ingenuity and care displayed by the managers of the great urban hotels and the clever resorts, no calling included more unimaginative slackers than did innkeeping. She had heard traveling men at Pemberton's and at Truax and Fine's complain of sour coffee and lumpy beds in the hotels of the smaller towns, of knives and forks that had to be wiped on the napkins before using, of shirt-sleeved proprietors who loafed within reach of the cuspidors while their wives tried to get the work done. She began to read the Hotel News and the Hotel Bulletin, and she called on the manager of a supply house for hotels. She read in the Bulletin of Bob Sidney, an ex-traveling man who, in partnership with a small capitalist, had started a syndicate of inns. He advertised, "The White Line Hotels. Fellow drummers, when you see the White Line sign hung out, you know you're in for good beds and good coffee." The idea seemed good to her. She fancied that traveling men would go from one White Line hotel to another. The hotels had been established in a dozen towns along the Pennsylvania Railroad, in Norristown, Reading, Williamsport, and others, and now Bob Sidney was promising to invade Ohio and Indiana. The blazed white line across the continent caught Una's growing commercial imagination, and she liked several of Mr. Sidney's ideas. The hotels would wire ahead to others of the line for accommodations for the traveler, and a man known to the line could get credit at any of its houses by being registered on identifying cards. She decided to capture Mr. Sidney. She made plans. In the spring she took a mysterious 2 weeks' leave of absence and journeyed through New York State, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana. The woman who had quite recently regarded it as an adventure to go to Brooklyn was so absorbed in her big idea that she didn't feel self-conscious, even when she talked to men on the train. If they smacked their lips and obviously said to themselves, "Gee, this is easy, not a bad little dame," she steered them into discussing hotels, what they wanted at hotels and didn't get, what was their favorite hotel in towns in from 1,500 to 40,000 inhabitants, and precisely what details made it the favorite. She stayed at 2 or 3 places a day for at least one meal, hotels in tiny towns she had never heard of, and in larger towns that were fumbling for metropolitanism. She sought out all the summer resorts that were open so early. She talked to travelers, men and women, to hack drivers and to grocers supplying hotels, to proprietors and their wives, to clerks and waitresses and bellboys and unconsidered observant porters. She read circulars and the catalogues of furniture establishments. Finally, she visited each of Mr. Bob Sidney's White Line hotels. Aside from their arrangements for accommodations and credit, their superior cleanliness, good mattresses, and coffee with a real taste, she did not find them preferable to others. In their rows of cuspidors and shouldering desks, and barren offices hung with insurance calendars, and dining rooms ornamented with portraits of decomposed ducks, they were typical of all the hotels she had seen. On the train back to New York she formulated her suggestions for hotels, among which, in her own words, were the following: 1. Make the offices decent rooms. Remember living room at Gray Wolf Lodge. Take out desks. Guests to register and pay bills in small office off living room. Keep letters there too. Not much room needed and can't make pleasant room with miserable old desk sticking out into it. 2. Cut out the cuspidors. Have special room where drummers can play cards and tell stories and spit. Allow smoking in office, but make it pleasant. Remember chintz and wicker chairs at $3 each. Small round tables with reading lamps. Maybe fireplace. 3. Better pastry and soup, and keep coffee up to standard. One surprise in each meal, for example, novel form of eggs, good salad, or canned lobster cocktail. Remember the same old pork, beans, corned beef, steak, deadly cold boiled potato everywhere I went. 4. More attractive dining rooms, especially small tables for 2 and 4. Cater more to local customers with a la carte menus, not long, but good. 5. Women housekeepers, and pay 'em good. 6. Hygienic kitchens, and advertise 'em. 7. Train employees, as remember traveling man told me United Cigar Stores do. 8. Better accommodations for women. Remember several traveling men's wives told me they would go on many trips with husbands if they could get decent hotels in all these towns. 9. Not ape New York hotels, nix on gilt and palms and marble, but clean and tasty food, and don't have things like desks just because most hotels do. 3 hours after Una reached New York, she telephoned to the object of her secret commercial affections, the unconscious Mr. Robert Sidney, at the White Line Hotel's office. She was so excited that she took 10 minutes for calming herself before she telephoned. Every time she lifted the receiver from its hook, she thrust it back and mentally apologized to the operator. But when she got the office and heard Mr. Bob Sidney's raw voice shouting, "Yes, this is Mr. Sidney," Una was very cool. "This is Mrs. Schwirtz, realty salesman for Truax and Fine. I've just been through Pennsylvania, and I stayed at your White Line hotels. Of course, I have to be an expert on different sorts of accommodations, and I made some notes on your hotels, some suggestions you might be glad to have. If you care to, we might have lunch together tomorrow, and I'll give you the suggestions." Why, Of course I'm rather busy with our new Long Island operations, so if you have a date tomorrow, the matter can wait. But I thought you'd better have the suggestions while they were fresh in my mind. But perhaps I can lunch with you week after next if...
No, no, let's make it tomorrow.
Very well. Will you call for me here, Truax and Fine, Zodiac Building? Una arose at 6:30 next morning, to dress the part of the great business woman, and before she went to the office she had her hair waved. Mr. Bob Sidney called for her. He was a simple, energetic soul, with a derby on the back of his head, cheerful, clean-shaven, large-chinned, hoarse-voiced, rapidly revolving a chewed cigar. She, the commonplace, was highly evolved in comparison with Mr. Sidney, and there was no nervousness in her as she marched out in a $20 hat and casually said, "Let's go to the Waldorf. It's convenient and not at all bad." On the way over, Mr. Sidney fairly massaged his head with his agitated derby, cocked it over one eye and pushed it back to the crown of his head, in his efforts to find out what and why was Mrs. Una Schwirtz. He kept appraising her. It was obvious that he was trying to decide whether this mysterious telephone correspondent was an available widow who had heard of his charms. He finally stumbled over the grating beside the Waldorf and bumped into the carriage starter and dropped his dead cigar. But all the while Una steadily kept the conversation to the vernal beauties of Pennsylvania. Thanks to rice powder and the pride of a new hat, she looked cool and adequate. But she was thinking all the time, "I never could keep up this Beatrice Joline pose with Mr. Fine or Mr. Ross. Poor Una, with them she'd just have to blurt out that she wanted a job." She sailed up to a corner table by a window. The waiter gave the menu to Mr. Sidney, but she held out her hand for it. "This is my lunch. I'm a business woman, not just a woman," she said to Mr. Sidney, and she rapidly ordered a lunch which was shockingly imitative of one which Mr. Fine had once ordered for her.
"Pret hot day for April," said Mr. Sidney.
"Yes. Is the White Line going well?"
"Yump, doing a land office business."
"You're having trouble with your day clerk at Brockenfelt, I see."
"How'd you know?"
"Oh," she merely smiled.
"Well, that guy's a four-flush. Came to us from the New Willard, and to hear him tell it you'd think he was the guy that put the will in the Willard. But he's a credit grabber, that's what he is. Makes me think. Never forget one time I was up in Boston, and I met a coon porter, and he told me he was a friend of the president of the Pullman Company, and had persuaded him to put on steel cars. Bet a hat he believed it himself. That's about like this fellow. He's going to get the razoo. Gee, I hope you ain't a friend of his."
Una had perfectly learned the Boeotian dialect so strangely spoken by Mr. Sidney, and she was able to reply, "Oh, no, no, indeed, he ought to be fired. He gave me a room as though he were the superintendent of a free lodging house."
"But it's so hard to get trained employees that I hate to even let him go. Just to show you the way things go, just when I was trying to swing a deal for a new hotel, I had to bust off negotiations and go and train a new crew of chambermaids at Sansonville myself. You'd died laughing to seen me making beds and teaching those birds to clean a spitador, begging your pardon. But it certainly was some show, and I do, by gum, know a traveling man likes his bed tucked in at the foot. Oh, it's fierce! The traveling public kicks if they get bum service, and the help kick if you demand any service from 'em, and the boss gets it right in the collar button both ways from the ace."
"Well, I'm going to tell you how to have trained service, and how to make your hotels distinctive. They're good hotels, as hotels go, And you really do give people good coffee and good beds and credit conveniences, as you promise, but your hotels are not distinctive. I'm going to tell you how to make them so." Una had waited till Mr. Sidney had disposed of his soup and filet mignon. She spoke deliberately, almost sternly. She reached for her new silver-link bag, drew out immaculate typewritten schedules, and while he gaped she read to him precisely the faults of each of the hotels, her suggested remedies, and her general ideas of hotels, with less cuspidors, more originality, and a room where traveling men could be at home on a rainy Sunday. "Now you know, and I know," she wound up, "that the proprietor's ideal of a hotel is one to which traveling men will travel 60 miles on Saturday evening in order to spend Sunday there. You take my recommendations and you'll have that kind of hotels. At the same time women will be tempted there, and the local trade will go there when wife or the cook is away, or they want to give a big dinner." "It does sound like it had some possibilities," said Mr. Sidney, as she stopped for breath, after quite the most impassioned invocation of her life. She plunged in again. "Now the point of all this is that I want to be the general manager of certain departments of the line catering, service, decoration, and so on. I'll keep out of the financial end, and we'll work out the buying together. You know it's women who make the homes for people at home, and why not the homes for people traveling? I'm woman sales manager for Truax & Fine, sell direct, and 6 women under me. I'll show you my record of sales. I've been secretary to an architect, and studied architecture a little, and plenty other jobs. Now you take these suggestions of mine to your office and study 'em over with your partner, and we'll talk about the job for me by and by." She left him as quickly as she could, got back to her office, and in a shaking spasm of weeping relapsed into the old timorous Una. Tedious were the negotiations between Una and Mr. Sidney and his partner. They wanted her to make their hotels, and yet they had never heard of anything so nihilistic as actually having hotel offices without desks. They wanted her, and yet they didn't quite know about adding any more overhead at this stage of the game. Meantime Una sold lots and studied the economical buying of hotel supplies. She was always willing to go with Mr. Sidney and his partner to lunch, but they were brief lunches. She was busy, she said, and she had no time to "drop in at their office." When Mr. Sidney once tried to hold her hand, not seriously, but with his methodical system of never failing to look into any possibilities, she said sharply, "Don't try that. Let's save a lot of time by understanding that I'm what you would call straight." He apologized and assured her that he had known she was a high-class genuine lady all the time. The very roughness which, in Mr. Schwirtz, had abrased her, interested her in Mr. Sidney. She knew better now how to control human beings. She was fascinated by a comparison of her 4 average citizens, 4 men not vastly varied as seen in a streetcar, yet utterly different to one working with them. Schwirtz the lumbering, Troy Wilkins the roaring, Truax the politely whining, and Bob Sidney the hesitating. The negotiations seemed to arrive nowhere. Then, unexpectedly, Bob Sidney telephoned to her at her flat one evening. "Partner and I have just decided to take you on, if you'll come at $3,800 a year." Una hadn't even thought of the salary. She would gladly have gone to her new creative position at the 3,200 she was then receiving, but she showed her new training and demanded, "4,200." "Well, split the difference and call it 4,000 for the first year." "All right." Una stood in the center of the room. She had succeeded on her job. Then she knew that she wanted someone with whom to share the good news. She sat down and thought of her almost forgotten plan to adopt a child. Mr. Sidney had, during his telephone proclamation, suggested, "Come down to the office tomorrow and get acquainted. Haven't got a very big force, you know, but there's a couple of stenographers, good girls, crazy to meet the new boss, and a bright new Western fellow we thought we might try out as your assistant and publicity man, and there's an office boy that's a sketch. So come down and meet your subjects, as the fellow says." Una found the office, on Duane Street, to consist of 2 real rooms and a bare anteroom decorated with photographs of the several White Line hotels, set on maple-lined streets, with the local managers, in white waistcoats, standing proudly in front. She herself was to have a big, flat-topped desk in the same room with Mr. Sidney. The surroundings were crude compared with the Truax & Fein office, but she was excited. Here she would be a pioneer. "Now come in the other room," said Mr. Sidney, "and meet the stenographers and the publicity man I was telling you about on the phone." He opened a door and said, "Mrs. Schwirtz, want you shake hands with the fellow that's going to help you to put the line on the map, Mr. Babson." It was Walter Babson, who had risen from a desk and was gaping at her. End of chapter 22.